A millionaire sees the woman he loved in his youth begging on the streets, struggling to care for her twin toddlers. He instantly recognizes her, the same girl who used to humiliate him. But what he does next is completely unbelievable. If you enjoy stories like this, you can help us by leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. Before we start, tell us in the comments which city you're watching from. Enjoy. Blake Harrington, a ruthless billionaire, was crossing a busy city street when something at the edge of the urban chaos made him stop. Sitting on the sidewalk, right in front of the building that bore his name, was a woman who looked worn down. Her clothes were tattered, her hair tangled, and her face bore the clear marks of suffering. Beside her, two little boys, about 4 years old, shared the same abandonment. One of them, Cole, was quietly crying, whispering that he was hungry. The other, Noah, rubbed his eyes with his dirty little hands, mumbling about being tired. "It'll be okay, my loves. Mommy's here. We'll get through this," the woman said, her voice trembling as she tried to hide her desperation, gently stroking one child's hair. An unexpected tightness gripped Blake's chest. That face. Even covered by dirt and pain, he would recognize it anywhere. It was Grace Foster. The same Grace who once filled his youthful dreams, the girl he was hopelessly in love with, but who never gave him a chance. She had treated him with indifference, even mocked his attempts to get close. And now, there she was, so fragile, so exposed, so different. He stepped forward slowly, his heart pounding as if time had turned back. "Grace?" he called cautiously. The woman slowly lifted her head. Her eyes widened as she heard the familiar voice. Blake. The silence between them was heavy with everything left unsaid. She lowered her gaze, ashamed, as if she wanted to disappear. "What happened to you?" he asked, his voice thick with concern. Grace averted her eyes, hugging her children tighter. "It's none of your business. Go away, Blake." But he couldn't. Cole's muffled sobs and Noah's frightened look cut through him like a knife. That suffering couldn't be ignored. "I'm going to help you. Don't worry," he said firmly. "We don't need anything," she replied, trying to hold on to what little dignity she had left. "I'm not leaving you out here in the cold. You're coming with me, and I don't take no for an answer." The children watched him warily, but with a flicker of hope. Cole stopped crying and looked at his mother. Grace hesitated for a long moment, but Blake's steady gaze broke through her defenses. She knew there was no other choice. Blake pulled his phone from his pocket. "Bring the car around front in 5 minutes, he ordered his driver before putting the phone away. He reached out his hand to Grace. She took it slowly, with reluctance and shame. Shortly after, when the car arrived, Blake helped her in, carrying Noah in his arms while she held Cole. The boys were exhausted, resting their heads on their mother's shoulders as they settled in. The ride to Blake's mansion was heavy with silence. Grace stared out the window, lost in thought, while Blake glanced at her now and then, trying to piece together a story clearly marked by pain. When they arrived, Grace looked visibly uncomfortable, as if she didn't belong in that world. But what happened next would change everything for both of them. The mansion's enormous entryway swallowed them whole, Grace and her boys looking impossibly small against the marble floors and cathedral ceilings. Blake's housekeeper, Eleanor, appeared immediately, her eyes widening at the sight of the disheveled family but quickly composing herself. "Please prepare the guest suite, and we'll need a warm bath for everyone," Blake said calmly, as if bringing home homeless families was an everyday occurrence. Grace stood frozen, clutching her children. "This was a mistake," she whispered, turning toward the door. Blake gently placed his hand on her shoulder. "Please, just one night. The boys need food and rest. Tomorrow you can leave if you want." Noah looked up at his mother with wide eyes that reflected the chandelier's light. "Are we staying in a castle, Mommy?" he asked, his voice filled with innocent wonder. That simple question broke something in Grace. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she nodded, unable to speak. Eleanor led them upstairs to a suite bigger than any apartment Grace had ever lived in. The bathroom filled with steam as Elena prepared a warm bath for the boys. Cole and Noah giggled as they splashed in bubbles for the first time in months, their earlier fear temporarily forgotten. While the children bathed, Grace stood by the window, staring out at the manicured gardens below. "Why are you doing this?" she asked without turning around. "Because nobody should have to sleep on the street," Blake replied simply, standing at the doorway. "Especially not the girl who broke your heart." Her voice was bitter, edged with self-loathing. Blake stepped further into the room. "That was high school, Grace. We were children." She finally turned to face him, her eyes red-rimmed. "I was cruel to you. And now life has been cruel to you," he said quietly. "But that doesn't mean you deserve this." The boys emerged from the bathroom wrapped in towels too big for their small frames, looking younger and more vulnerable, without the dirt hiding their features. Elena brought trays of food, simple chicken soup, bread, and fruit. The boys ate ravenously, while Grace merely picked at her meal, pride still battling with necessity. After dinner, when the children were tucked into the enormous bed, their eyelids growing heavy, Blake hesitated at the door. "Get some rest. We can talk tomorrow." Grace nodded, unable to meet his eyes. After he left, she sat on the edge of the bed, watching her sons sleep peacefully for the first time in weeks. She touched Noah's cheek gently, then Cole's, before finally allowing herself to cry, silent tears that carried the weight of everything she had lost. But she never expected that the home of the man she once rejected would become the place where she found something far more precious than shelter. Morning light streamed through windows larger than Grace's former apartment door. For a moment, disoriented by the silk sheets and unfamiliar luxury, she forgot where she was. Then reality crashed back. The sidewalk, Blake's unexpected appearance, this mansion. Cole and Noah were already awake, whispering to each other and exploring the room with cautious excitement. Fresh clothes, perfectly sized, had been laid out for all of them. Grace stared at the simple but elegant outfit meant for her, running her fingers over fabric finer than anything she'd worn in years. After they dressed, Elena escorted them downstairs to a sunlit breakfast room where Blake sat reading financial reports. He stood immediately, his expression softening at the sight of the boys looking remarkably different after a night of proper rest. "You look much better," he said gently to Grace, gesturing toward the table laden with pancakes, fruit, and juice. The boys climbed eagerly into chairs while Grace hesitated. "We should go after breakfast," she said quietly. Blake set his coffee down. "Go where exactly?" She had no answer. The meal progressed with awkward small talk, Blake asking the boys simple questions about their favorite colors and animals. Noah, the more outgoing of the twins, gradually warmed to him, while Cole remained watchful and quiet. "Mrs. Abernathy will be here at 10, Blake mentioned casually. Grace's head snapped up. "Who?" "A private tutor, just to assess where the boys are educationally." Grace pushed back from the table. "I didn't ask for that." "You haven't asked for anything," Blake countered. "That's the problem." After breakfast, Elena took the boys to the garden to play, leaving Blake and Grace alone. The silence between them grew heavy until Blake finally spoke. "Tell me what happened, Grace, please." Her resistance crumbled under the weight of years of struggle. "Their father left when I was 7 months pregnant," she began, her voice barely audible. "He wasn't expecting twins. One baby was already too much responsibility for him." Blake listened without interrupting as she recounted losing her teaching position, when the school found out she was pregnant and unmarried, how she'd worked multiple jobs until daycare costs exceeded what she could earn, the apartment evictions, the shelters that separated men from women, making it impossible to find a partner who would accept both her and 2 children. "Last month my car broke down. That was the final straw. No car meant no job. No job meant no apartment." She looked up, her eyes clear and defiant despite her circumstances. "But I kept my boys with me. That's the one thing I'm proud of. I never abandoned them." Blake nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small worn photograph. He slid it across the table. Grace picked it up, confused, then gasped. It was a picture of her at 17, smiling next to a gangly, awkward Blake at a school function. On the back, in faded ink, "The day I almost told you." "Told me what?" she whispered. "That you were the reason I worked so hard, to become someone you couldn't ignore." His voice wavered slightly. "I kept that photo all these years, not out of resentment, but as a reminder that rejection can be a powerful motivator." Grace stared at the photograph, her hand trembling. "I was so shallow then." "We both were, in different ways," he admitted. "But now we have a second chance to know each other as adults." The sound of children's laughter floated in from the garden. Grace watched through the window as her sons chased butterflies, their faces alight with simple joy. "Stay," Blake said softly. "Not forever, just until you find your footing." Grace turned back to him, her defenses weakening. But before she could answer, Eleanor rushed into the room, her expression alarmed. "Mr. Harrington, there's someone at the gate. A man demanding to see Grace and the children. He's quite insistent and—" The color drained from Grace's face so quickly that Blake stood up in concern. "It's him," she whispered, terror flooding her eyes. "It's the boy's father." The security monitor showed a man pacing at the gate, tall, unshaven, with the raw-edged agitation of someone desperate or dangerous or both. Grace couldn't breathe as she stared at his face. "Marcus," she whispered, the name itself a wound. Blake's expression hardened. "How did he find you?" "I don't know. He disappeared for 4 years without a word." Her voice cracked. "He doesn't even know what they look like now." Blake turned to Eleanor. "Get the boys inside immediately." Through the window, Grace watched Elena hurrying across the lawn, gathering her confused children. Noah waved at a butterfly as Elena ushered them toward a side entrance, away from any view of the front gate. "What does he want?" Blake asked quietly. Grace's hands trembled. "Money, probably. He always needed money." She looked at Blake with unexpected fierceness. "I won't let him near them, ever." Blake nodded, his decision made. "Wait here." Grace grabbed his arm. "No, you don't know him. He's dangerous," Blake finished. "All the more reason for you to stay inside." The intercom buzzed. "Sir, the gentleman at the gate is becoming agitated." Blake gently removed Grace's hand from his arm. "Trust me," he said simply. She watched from the window as Blake walked calmly down the long drive toward the gate. Marcus's posture changed immediately, becoming more aggressive as Blake approached. Even from a distance, Grace could see Marcus gesturing wildly, pointing toward the house. After several tense minutes, Blake took out his wallet. Money changed hands. Marcus looked briefly toward the mansion before turning away. Blake remained at the gate until Marcus's figure disappeared down the street. When Blake returned, his expression was grim. "He said he saw you getting into my car yesterday, followed us, and then came back today." Blake's voice was carefully neutral. "He claims he wants to reconcile." Grace gave a bitter laugh. "He wants whatever he thinks you have that he can take." "I paid him to leave," Blake admitted. "It won't solve the problem permanently, but it buys us time." "Us?" Grace whispered. Blake met her gaze directly. "Yes, us. I told him if he ever approaches you or the boys again, I'll have him arrested. I also mentioned that I have excellent lawyers." Fresh tears filled Grace's eyes. "You shouldn't have to deal with my mistakes." "The only mistake was his, leaving you when you needed him most." Blake's voice softened. "Grace, I want to help, but you need to let me." From upstairs came the sound of small feet running, followed by childish laughter. The momentary crisis had passed, but its shadow remained. "What if he comes back?" Grace asked. "Then we'll handle it," Blake promised. "But right now your boys need stability more than anything." Grace nodded slowly, making her decision. "We'll stay for a little while." What she didn't say, couldn't say yet, was how terrified she felt. Not of Marcus returning, but of the way Blake looked at her, as if she were still worthy of protection, as if her fall from grace hadn't made her untouchable. Little did she know that this moment would mark the beginning of a transformation none of them could have imagined. 2 weeks passed in a strange, suspended reality. The mansion's guest suite became a sanctuary where Grace and her boys slowly began to heal. The twins thrived under Mrs. Abernathy's gentle tutoring, their natural intelligence emerging from beneath layers of stress and uncertainty. One evening, after the boys were asleep, Grace found Blake in his study, a room lined with books that smelled of leather and accomplishment. He looked up from his computer as she hesitated in the doorway. "I need to find work," she said without preamble. Blake leaned back in his chair. "There's no rush." "There is for me." Grace stepped further into the room. "I can't depend on your charity forever. Is that what you think this is?" He gestured for her to sit, which she did reluctantly. "Grace, do you know what I do?" She shrugged. "You're some kind of financial genius. Everyone knows Harrington Investments." "I identify potential. In markets, in companies." He paused. "In people." Grace looked away. "I'm not an investment opportunity." "No, you're much more valuable." Blake's voice grew serious. "You have a teaching degree you never got to use. What if I told you there's a position at the Harrington Foundation's Education Center? They work with underprivileged children." She stared at him. "You can't just create a job for me." "I'm not. The position has been open for months. No one has been right for it." Grace's heartbeat quickened with something almost forgotten. Hope. "The boys would attend the center's preschool program while you work," he finished. "It's all on the same campus." For a moment she looked young again, the weight of survival lifting slightly from her shoulders. "Why are you doing all this?" Blake considered her question carefully. "When I saw you on that sidewalk, something shifted in me. All these years building wealth, and for what? You reminded me that success means nothing if it isn't shared." Later that night, Grace stood at her bedroom window, watching moonlight silver the garden below. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine a future, one where her sons wouldn't know hunger or fear, where she might reclaim her dignity and purpose. She didn't hear Blake approaching until he spoke. "Can't sleep?" he asked softly. She turned, self-conscious in her borrowed nightgown. "I'm not used to feeling safe." Something passed between them then, a current of understanding deeper than words. Blake took a step closer, then stopped himself. "I have something for you." He held out a small box. Inside was a simple silver key on a plain ring. Grace looked at him, questioning. "It's to the guest house behind the garden. More privacy for you and the boys. A place that could feel more like your own." Grace closed her fingers around the key, its metal warm from Blake's hand. "Thank you," she whispered, the words inadequate for what she truly felt. Neither of them moved for a long moment. Then Blake smiled gently. "Good night, Grace." As he walked away, Grace called after him, "I'll take the job. At the education center." He paused, looking back at her. "They're lucky to have you." That night, Grace slept peacefully for the first time in years, the key clutched in her hand like a talisman. What she didn't know was that Blake sat awake in his study until dawn, making phone calls to ensure that Marcus would never threaten her or the boys again. And neither of them could have predicted how a simple silver key would unlock so much more than just a door. The Harrington Foundation Education Center stood like a beacon of modern architecture among the struggling neighborhood it served. Grace's hands trembled slightly as she straightened her simple but elegant blouse, a gift from Blake that she'd initially resisted. "You look beautiful, Mommy," Noah said earnestly as they walked toward the entrance, each boy holding one of her hands. The center's director, Dr. Winters, welcomed them warmly, showing the twins to their classroom before leading Grace to a bright space filled with learning materials and small tables. "Mr. Harrington speaks very highly of you," Dr. Winters mentioned casually. Grace tensed. "I hope to earn my position based on merit, not connection." Dr. Winters smiled knowingly. "Blake doesn't recommend people lightly, regardless of personal feelings. This center is his passion project." Throughout that first day, Grace discovered a talent she'd feared lost, the ability to connect with children, especially those carrying invisible burdens. By afternoon, she'd helped a withdrawn 6-year-old write her first complete sentence and coaxed a smile from a boy who reminded her painfully of Cole. When Blake arrived to drive them home, he found Grace surrounded by children, reading a story with such animation that even the skeptical pre-teens were captivated. He stood watching unnoticed, something shifting in his expression. Later that evening, after moving into the garden guest house, a charming cottage with rooms the boys immediately claimed as their own, Grace sat on the small porch, savoring her independence, even within Blake's protection. He joined her, handing over her first paycheck. "Congratulations." Grace stared at the check, emotion tightening her throat. "It's too much." "It's the standard salary for your position," Blake replied evenly. She looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I've been so focused on surviving that I'd forgotten how it feels to actually live." Blake sat beside her in the gathering twilight. "The center's children adore you already. They're remarkable kids. They're resilient." She trailed off, thinking of one girl in particular who'd shared a crayon with Cole despite having so little herself. "Like their teacher," Blake said softly. The moment stretched between them, comfortable yet charged with unspoken feelings. From inside came the sound of the twins playing, their laughter a reminder of childhood's resilience. "I should put them to bed," Grace said finally, rising. Blake stood as well, their bodies briefly close in the doorway. "Good night, Grace." "Good night," she whispered, watching him walk back toward the main house, silhouetted against the garden lights. That night, tucking her sons into beds with fresh sheets and stuffed animals they'd never had before, Grace felt a strange mixture of gratitude and unease. Cole looked up at her with serious eyes. "Is Mr. Blake going to be our new daddy?" he asked suddenly. The question caught her completely off guard. "No, sweetheart, Mr. Blake is just helping us." "But he looks at you the way princes look at princesses in the storybooks at school," Noah chimed in. Grace kissed their foreheads to hide her flushed face. "Time for sleep, my loves." Later, alone in her room, Grace confronted the truth she'd been avoiding. She was falling for Blake Harrington, the awkward boy she'd once dismissed, now a man whose kindness outshone his wealth, and it terrified her, because deep inside a voice whispered that she would never be his equal, that gratitude and love should never be confused, and most of all that people like her didn't get fairy tale endings. What Grace couldn't know was that across the garden, Blake stood at his window, watching the light in her cottage, fighting his own battle between desire and respect, wondering if the chasm of their past could ever truly be bridged. But both their worlds were about to collide in ways neither expected. 3 months passed in a rhythm that began to feel almost normal. Grace excelled at the education center, gaining confidence as she watched both her students and her own sons flourish. The cottage became truly theirs, filled with artwork, books, and the unmistakable energy of 2 growing boys. Blake remained a constant presence, supportive but careful, never crossing the invisible line Grace maintained between them. They shared dinners, weekend outings with the twins, and late-night conversations that often lasted until dawn, rediscovering each other as adults who had been shaped by very different lives. On a crisp autumn evening, Blake hosted a fundraising gala for the education center at his mansion. Grace had reluctantly accepted his insistence that she attend as a representative of the teaching staff, wearing a midnight blue dress that Elena had helped her select. "You don't have to do this," Blake said quietly as they stood in his study before the event. "I know these functions aren't your idea of fun." Grace smoothed the unfamiliar fabric, feeling painfully out of place despite her new confidence. "The center deserves support. If my presence helps with that, I'll manage." The gala itself was a glittering affair filled with San Francisco's elite, people who moved through wealth and privilege as easily as breathing. Grace stood at the edge of the ballroom, watching Blake charm potential donors with practiced ease. "So you're the charity case we've been hearing about," came a cool female voice behind her. Grace turned to face a striking woman in designer clothes whose smile didn't reach her eyes. "Vanessa Harrington," the woman continued, "Blake's sister-in-law, or rather his former sister-in-law since the divorce." Grace forced a polite smile. "Grace Foster. I work at the education center and live in Blake's guest house with your children." The pause was deliberate, cutting. Before Grace could respond, Vanessa stepped closer. "A word of advice. Blake has a habit of rescuing strays. First my sister, then numerous projects through his foundation. Once he fixes what's broken, he tends to lose interest." The words landed like slaps. Grace maintained her composure with effort. "Thank you for your concern, but his last rescue was a brilliant artist from the wrong side of town," Vanessa continued mercilessly. "That lasted almost 6 months before he moved on to the next charitable cause." Blake appeared beside them, his expression darkening as he sensed the tension. "Vanessa, I wasn't expecting you tonight. Just saying hello to your latest project." Vanessa kissed his cheek before gliding away, leaving emotional devastation in her wake. Grace stood frozen, everything she'd feared suddenly confirmed by a stranger who knew Blake's patterns all too well. "Whatever she said, ignore it," Blake urged quietly. Grace looked up at him, seeing for the first time the distance between their worlds reflected in the glittering chandeliers and designer clothes surrounding them. "Am I a project to you, Blake? A broken thing you're fixing?" "Grace, no. Do you collect people who need saving? Is that what this has been?" Her voice remained low but had begun to tremble. Blake reached for her arm, but she stepped back. "I need some air," she managed before walking quickly toward the garden doors. Outside, the cool night air did nothing to calm the storm inside her. Blake followed, his face stricken. "Vanessa thrives on creating drama," he said. "She never forgave me for supporting her sister through their divorce. But was she wrong?" Grace faced him directly. "Have there been others you've rescued before me?" Blake hesitated too long before answering. "I've helped people, yes, but this is different." "You're different." "How?" she demanded. "Because you had a crush on me 20 years ago. Because seeing me homeless fulfilled some twisted fantasy of having power over the girl who rejected you." "That's not fair," Blake said quietly. "None of this is fair." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "I've let myself depend on you, let my children love you. But we're just another charitable tax deduction, aren't we?" The pain in Blake's eyes should have stopped her, but months of suppressed fears came pouring out. "I can't do this anymore. I can't pretend that this," she gestured between them, "could ever be real. We don't belong in your world, Blake." "Grace, please." A commotion from inside interrupted them. Elena appeared at the garden door, her expression urgent. "Mr. Harrington, it's the boys. There's been an accident." Grace's world stopped. "What happened?" "They were playing upstairs in the game room," Eleanor explained rapidly as they rushed inside. "Cole climbed up to reach something and fell through the glass table." Grace ran ahead, her heart pounding. Upstairs, Noah sat crying while Mrs. Abernathy, who had been watching the children during the gala, pressed a towel against Cole's bleeding arm. "The ambulance is coming," someone said. The next hours passed in a blur of hospital corridors and medical terms. Cole needed surgery to remove glass fragments and repair damaged tendons in his arm. Grace sat motionless in the waiting room, still wearing her gala dress, now stained with her son's blood. Blake remained beside her despite her earlier words, his presence solid and unwavering. When he reached for her hand, she didn't pull away. "He'll be okay," Blake promised. "I've called the best pediatric surgeon in the city." Grace nodded numbly. "This is my fault. I should have been with them instead of pretending to belong at that party." "Stop," Blake said firmly. "Children have accidents. This isn't anyone's fault." The surgeon appeared hours later, tired but smiling. "The surgery went perfectly. He'll need physical therapy, but children heal remarkably well." Relief flooded through Grace. As they were allowed into recovery to see Cole, small and pale against the hospital sheets, his arm heavily bandaged, Noah rushed to his twin's side, his earlier tears replaced by fierce protectiveness. Grace kissed Cole's forehead while he slept off the anesthesia. "My brave boy," she whispered. In that moment of crisis, the earlier argument seemed distant and foolish. When Blake stepped into the room with a stuffed bear for Cole and coloring books for Noah, Grace met his eyes with wordless gratitude. Later, as Cole slept and Noah dozed in a chair beside him, Blake led Grace into the hallway. "I need to tell you something," he said, his expression serious. "About what Vanessa said." Grace shook her head. "It doesn't matter now." "It does." Blake took a deep breath. "Yes, I've helped people before, but I've never invited anyone to live in my home, never introduced anyone to my private world the way I have with you and the boys." He reached for her hands, holding them gently. "You asked how this is different. The truth is, I never loved any of them, Grace, but I've loved you since we were 17 years old." The confession hung between them, as fragile and precious as the sleeping child in the room behind them. "I don't know if I can trust this," Grace whispered, "or myself." "Then we'll take it one day at a time," Blake promised, starting with getting Cole home and healthy. As dawn broke over the hospital, Grace allowed herself to lean against Blake's shoulder, exhaustion finally claiming her. What she didn't see was the way he watched over all three of them, not with the satisfaction of a benefactor, but with the devotion of a man who had found his family at last. Cole's recovery became the center of their universe. Grace took leave from the education center, moving temporarily back into the main house so that Cole could avoid the stairs in the guest house. Blake rearranged his schedule to be present for doctor appointments and physical therapy sessions, his business empire temporarily taking second place to a small boy's healing. One evening, as Grace sat beside Cole's bed, reading him a story, Blake appeared in the doorway with Noah on his shoulders. The sight of them, her serious son listening intently to the tale, her adventurous one giggling atop Blake's shoulders, created an ache of longing she could no longer deny. "Mommy, look what Blake taught me," Noah exclaimed, holding up a perfectly folded paper airplane. "Very impressive," she smiled, her eyes meeting Blake's over the children's heads. Later, after the twins were asleep, Grace found Blake in the kitchen making tea, a simple domestic action that somehow touched her deeply. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything you've done for Cole, for all of us." Blake handed her a steaming mug. "They're remarkable children. You've done an amazing job raising them, especially given the circumstances." Grace stared into her tea. "I've been thinking about what you said at the hospital, about loving me since we were teenagers." Blake grew very still. "I meant it. I know." She looked up at him. "That's what scares me." His brow furrowed. "Why?" "Because people love differently when they've never known real loss." Her fingers tightened around the warm mug. "You love the idea of me, Blake, the girl from high school and the woman who needs saving. But real love isn't about rescue fantasies or childhood crushes." Blake set his own mug down. "Then tell me what real love is, Grace. Educate me." "Real love is choosing someone even when it's difficult. It's sitting in hospital waiting rooms and changing sheets after nightmares. It's seeing someone at their absolute worst and staying anyway." Her voice caught. "It's what my sons have shown me every day since they were born. And you don't think I'm capable of that kind of love?" The hurt in his voice was palpable. Grace shook her head. "I don't know if you are. You've never had to be." Blake moved closer, his eyes intense. "Then give me the chance to prove it." Before she could respond, the doorbell rang, an unusual occurrence so late in the evening. Blake frowned, checking his security system on his phone. "It's Marcus," he said, his voice hardening. Grace went pale. "The boys are safe upstairs with Elena watching over them," Blake assured her. "Stay here." "No," Grace said firmly, squaring her shoulders. "I need to face him myself. I've hidden long enough." Together they went to the front door, where security had already detained Marcus, sober and better dressed than his last appearance, but no less unsettling to Grace. "I just want to talk," Marcus insisted. "I heard about Cole's accident. He's my son, too." Grace stepped forward. "You gave up that right 4 years ago." Marcus had the decency to look ashamed. "I know. I was a coward. But I've changed. I'm stable now. I have a job, an apartment." "Congratulations," Grace said coldly. "But that doesn't erase what you did. The boys need a father," Marcus pressed. "They have me," Blake said quietly from beside Grace. Marcus's eyes narrowed. "Playing house with a billionaire doesn't make him their father. I have legal rights." Grace felt rather than saw Blake tense beside her, but before he could speak, she found her own voice, stronger than she'd ever heard it. "You have nothing, Marcus. No rights, no claims, no place in our lives. I've filed abandonment charges. I have witnesses who'll testify that you left me pregnant and destitute. My lawyer," she glanced at Blake, "has prepared documentation of every missed child support payment, every birthday you ignored, every night the boys cried for a father who never came." Marcus took a step back, shock replacing his earlier confidence. "I don't want your money," Grace continued steadily. "I just want you to understand that my sons have suffered enough. If you truly care about them at all, you'll leave us in peace." For a long moment, Marcus stood silent. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. Not in anger or defiance, but with the slumped shoulders of a man finally facing the consequences of his choices. When the security gates closed behind him, Grace let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Blake turned to her, his expression a mixture of pride and awe. "You said my lawyer," he noted quietly. "Did I?" Grace gave a shaky smile. "I meant your lawyer, of course." Blake shook his head. "No, you were right the first time. My lawyers are your lawyers. Everything I have is yours if you want it, Grace." The sincerity in his voice pierced through the last of her defenses. "Blake, you asked if I can love the way you described, through difficulty and pain and messy reality." He took her hands in his. "I've loved you through 20 years of separation, through seeing you with another man's children, through your rejection, both past and present." He stepped closer, his voice dropping. "Now I'm asking you to let me love you through whatever comes next, not as a rescue or a project or a fantasy, but as the woman you are today. Scars, fears, amazing children, and all the strength it took to survive what would have broken most people." Grace stood perfectly still, feeling something shift inside her, like the last piece of a puzzle finally falling into place. "I'm terrified," she admitted in a whisper. "Of what?" Blake asked gently. "Of believing in this. In us. In happy endings." She looked up at him, vulnerability and hope warring in her eyes. "I've learned the hard way that life doesn't offer second chances. And yet, here we are," Blake said, pulling her closer. "If that's not a second chance, I don't know what is." In the quiet of the massive foyer, with moonlight streaming through the windows, Grace made her choice. Not out of gratitude or necessity, but from a place of emerging strength. She reached up, placing her palm against Blake's cheek. "The boys and I come as a package deal," she said softly. "Forever." Blake covered her hand with his own. "I wouldn't have it any other way." What she couldn't have known then was how that single moment of courage would transform not just her own life, but create ripples of change that would reach far beyond the walls of Blake's mansion. 6 months later, spring had transformed the gardens surrounding the guest house, which Grace and the boys still insisted on calling home, despite Blake's gentle suggestions about moving into the main house. Roses climbed trellises, wildflowers dotted the lawn, and Cole's arm had healed completely, leaving only a thin scar that he proudly called his battle wound. The education center had expanded under Grace's guidance, now offering evening classes for parents and weekend programs that had become a community cornerstone. Blake had stepped back from daily management of his companies, focusing instead on the foundation and, more importantly, building a relationship with Grace and the twins that grew stronger each day. On a perfect Saturday morning, Blake appeared at the guest house door carrying a picnic basket. "Who's ready for an adventure?" he called. Noah came running immediately, always eager for anything new. Cole followed more cautiously, his natural reserve slowly giving way to trust where Blake was concerned. "Where are we going?" Grace asked, smiling at his obvious excitement. "It's a surprise," Blake replied mysteriously, "but I promise it's worth it." The drive took them through the city and across the Golden Gate Bridge, winding along coastal roads, until they reached a secluded beach, accessible only by a private path. The twins raced ahead toward the shore while Blake spread a blanket on the sand. "This is beautiful," Grace said, breathing in the salt air. "How did you find it?" "I bought it," Blake said casually. "This whole cove," Grace stared at him. "You bought a beach?" "For the foundation," he clarified. "We're building a summer camp here for children from the education center. Swimming lessons, marine biology, environmental science." Grace watched her sons at the water's edge, their small figures silhouetted against the vast Pacific. "They'll love that." "I hope so," Blake said, suddenly seeming nervous. "Because I was thinking the camp could be named after them." "After Cole and Noah?" Grace asked, confused. "The Harrington Foster Children's Camp," Blake explained. If that's okay with you." Something in his tone made Grace turn to look at him fully. What she saw took her breath away. Blake kneeling on the blanket, holding a small velvet box. "I brought you here because this place represents everything I want our future to be," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "Open, beautiful, full of possibility." He opened the box to reveal a simple but elegant ring, a sapphire surrounded by small diamonds that caught the sunlight. "Grace Foster, will you marry me? Will you let me be a father to your sons and build a life together that neither of us could have imagined when we met again that day on the sidewalk?" Grace felt tears forming, but these were different from all the tears she'd shed before, not of loss or fear or desperation, but of a joy so pure it almost hurt. Before she could answer, small footsteps pounded across the sand. Cole and Noah arrived breathlessly beside them, their eyes widening at the sight of the ring. "Are you going to be our dad for real?" Noah asked Blake directly. Blake looked to Grace, waiting for her answer. She realized in that moment that this wasn't just her decision. It belonged to all of them, this fragile, beautiful family they'd begun to build. "Only if all three of you want me," Blake said solemnly. "Will we get to change our last names to Harrington?" Cole asked pragmatically. Blake nodded. "If you'd like to." The twins exchanged one of their silent twin-language looks that Grace had never been able to decipher. Then Noah nodded firmly, while Cole gave a small, serious smile. "We approve," Noah announced grandly. All eyes turned to Grace. The woman who had once slept on sidewalks to keep her children safe now stood on her own private beach, being offered a life she'd never dared to dream about. "Yes," she said simply, her voice strong and clear. "Yes to all of it." Blake slipped the ring onto her finger, then gathered all three of them into his arms. Over the twins' heads, his eyes met Grace's with a promise deeper than words could express. Later, as they walked along the shore, the boys running ahead to collect shells, Blake squeezed Grace's hand. "There's something else I want to show you." Beyond a curve in the shoreline stood a beautiful house, modern but warm, with walls of glass facing the ocean and a wraparound deck. "The camp director's house," Blake explained, "but it could be ours on weekends and holidays, a place just for the four of us." Grace took in the perfect proportions of the house, how naturally it nestled into the landscape. "You designed this for us, didn't you? Even before you knew I'd say yes." Blake smiled. "I had hope." As the sun began to set over the Pacific, casting golden light across the water, Grace realized that the universe had brought her full circle, from rejection to homelessness, to a love deeper and truer than anything she could have imagined as a shallow teenager who once dismissed an awkward boy's affections. What she didn't know yet was that the greatest surprise of all was still waiting to be discovered. The wedding was intimate but elegant, held in the garden where Grace and the boys had begun their new life. Cole and Noah, handsome in matching suits, proudly walked their mother down the aisle to where Blake waited beneath an arch of white roses. "You look like a real princess, Mommy," Noah whispered as they approached. Grace squeezed her son's hands, her heart too full for words. The simple ivory dress she'd chosen felt like a symbol of everything she'd become, elegant but strong, beautiful without pretense. The ceremony itself was brief, with vows that spoke of second chances and families built on choice rather than obligation. When Blake knelt to include Cole and Noah in his promises, there wasn't a dry eye among the small gathering of guests. "I vow to love your mother with everything I am," he told the boys solemnly. "And I vow to be the father you deserve, to support your dreams, respect your uniqueness, and love you as my own sons for all my days." The reception flowed seamlessly from ceremony to celebration, with children from the education center performing songs they'd prepared especially for their beloved teacher. Dr. Winters raised a toast to the couple who had transformed not just their own lives, but an entire community. "To Blake and Grace," she said, her glass catching the late afternoon light, who remind us that true wealth has nothing to do with money and everything to do with courage, compassion, and love. As evening settled over the garden, Blake led Grace to a quiet corner away from the festivities. "Happy?" he asked, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "Beyond words," she admitted, "but there's something I need to tell you." Blake's expression grew concerned. "What is it?" Grace took his hand and placed it gently against her stomach. "We're going to need a bigger house at the beach. The boys have always wanted a little sister." The look of wonder that transformed Blake's face was something Grace knew she would remember forever. Pure joy mingled with awe and love so intense it was almost tangible. "When did you find out?" he whispered. "Yesterday," she said. "I wanted to wait until we were married to tell you." Blake pulled her close, careful even in his excitement. "A daughter," he breathed, as if testing the word. From across the garden came the sound of children's laughter. Cole and Noah racing between tables with their new cousins, Blake's nieces and nephews, who had welcomed them without hesitation into the extended family. "Should we tell them now?" Blake asked, nodding toward the twins. Grace shook her head. "Let's give them this perfect day first. Tomorrow is soon enough for new adventures." As night fell, the garden transformed under thousands of tiny lights strung through the trees. The guests danced beneath the stars while Cole and Noah, exhausted from excitement, fell asleep on a cushioned bench, leaning against each other as they had since before birth. Blake found Grace watching their sons, her expression thoughtful. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, slipping his arm around her waist. "About that day on the sidewalk," she admitted. "How close I came to sending you away. How pride almost cost us everything." "But it didn't," Blake reminded her gently. "Some things are simply meant to be." Later that night, after guests had departed and the twins were tucked into bed, Blake carried Grace across the threshold of the main house, now truly their home. In their room, he placed her carefully on their bed as if she were made of precious glass. "Mrs. Harrington," he said, the name both strange and perfect on his lips. Grace reached for him, all her former hesitation gone. "I love you," she said simply. "Not for what you've given us, but for who you are." "And who am I?" Blake asked, lying beside her. "The boy who never stopped believing in love," she whispered, "and the man who taught me how to believe again, too." 9 months later, in a room filled with flowers, Grace gave birth to a tiny, perfect daughter with Blake's eyes and Grace's determined chin. Cole and Noah stood beside the hospital bed, their expressions solemn with the responsibility of brotherhood. "She's so small," Cole whispered in awe. "But she'll grow," Noah assured him with the confidence of an 8-year-old expert. Blake sat beside Grace on the bed, one arm around her shoulders, the other hand gently stroking his daughter's cheek. "What shall we name her?" he asked softly. Grace looked at her sons, now proudly bearing the name Harrington Foster, then at Blake, whose love had transformed her world, and finally at the tiny miracle in her arms, living proof that second chances were real. "Hope," she said with certainty. "Her name is Hope." As if recognizing her name, the baby opened her eyes, looking up at the circle of faces above her, a family created not by blood or circumstance, but by choice and love, and the courage to begin again. Outside the window, spring sunshine illuminated a world of possibilities. In that moment, Grace knew with absolute certainty that no fairy tale could match the simple, profound truth of their journey, from sidewalk to sanctuary, from strangers to family, from hopelessness to hope. And somewhere in the cosmic tapestry that weaves all lives together, the universe smiled at another circle perfectly closed.